What would you do if the person you love suddenly disappeared, leaving behind secrets that could shatter everything? A millionaire tests his fiancée's loyalty with a life-altering deception, but her response changes everything. Are you ready to uncover the truth behind their love story? Watch now. Jason Trivet adjusted the microphone on the sleek podium, his tailored suit catching the shimmer of the ballroom lights. Tonight was a milestone, a celebration of his company's latest breakthrough in artificial intelligence. The room buzzed with energy, a mix of laughter, clinking glasses, and murmured congratulations. But despite the electric atmosphere, Jason's smile felt painted on, a brittle facade against the storm brewing inside. His eyes darted across the crowd, landing on Claire. She stood near the edge of the room, a vision of grace in her emerald green dress, laughing softly at something one of his colleagues had said. She looked radiant, perfect even, but something about her laughter felt distant. Jason's chest tightened. Was it genuine, or was it all for show? He shook the thought away, chastising himself for doubting her. Claire had been nothing but supportive, hadn't she? The sound of polite applause brought him back to the moment. He cleared his throat and launched into his speech, thanking his team, investors, and everyone who'd made their success possible. Yet, even as the words flowed effortlessly, his mind wandered back to the envelope he'd found waiting for him earlier that day. It was unmarked, slipped under the door of his office. Inside was a single sheet of paper typed with no name or signature. "Claire is with you for your money. Wake up before it's too late." The words had rattled him, coiling like a serpent in his gut. Jason wasn't a stranger to skepticism. As a self-made millionaire, he'd been warned countless times about opportunists. But Claire? The woman who'd stood by him through late nights and countless work trips. Surely she wasn't capable of such deceit. Or was she? The applause swelled as Jason finished his speech, bringing him back to reality. He stepped off the stage and was immediately engulfed by handshakes and compliments. His head nodded in automatic gratitude, but his gaze kept darting back to Claire. She was chatting with Sophie Rivers, her closest friend. Sophie glanced in his direction, her expression unreadable, before turning back to Claire. Were they talking about him? He shook his head. Paranoia was eating him alive. When the crowd finally thinned, Jason made his way to Claire. She greeted him with a warm smile and a soft touch on his arm, her voice a soothing melody. "You were amazing up there. Everyone was hanging on your every word." "Thanks," he replied, his tone betraying none of the turmoil inside. "You seem to be enjoying yourself tonight." Her brow furrowed slightly, just for a second. "Of course. Why wouldn't I be?" she asked, her voice light but cautious. Jason hesitated, the words threatening to spill out. "Are you with me for my money? Is this all just a lie?" But he bit them back, forcing a smile instead. "No reason. Just wanted to make sure you're okay." She tilted her head, studying him for a beat longer than comfortable, but then she nodded. "I'm fine, Jason. Really." The rest of the evening blurred into a series of polite conversations and strained smiles. Jason felt like an actor in a play, reciting lines he no longer believed. The anonymous letter had planted a seed of doubt, and no amount of laughter or reassurance seemed able to uproot it. Later that night, back in their shared apartment, Jason sat on the edge of the bed, the envelope clutched in his hands. Claire was in the bathroom, humming softly as she removed her makeup. The sound felt unbearably normal, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Jason stared at the letter again, reading the words over and over. His mind spun with questions he couldn't answer. Why now? Who had sent it? And most importantly, what if it was true? When Claire finally emerged, her face fresh and glowing, she paused at the sight of him. "Jason, are you okay? You look tense." He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the envelope. For a moment, he considered showing her, asking her outright. But something, fear perhaps, held him back. "Just a lot on my mind," he said instead. She sat beside him, her presence warm and grounding. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" The sincerity in her eyes made his chest ache. He wanted to believe her, needed to believe her. But the words in the letter loomed like a shadow over their intimacy. He managed a weak smile. I know, I just need to sort through it myself first. Claire leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand finding his. I'm here whenever you're ready, she murmured. Jason nodded, his throat tight. But as she drifted off to sleep beside him, her breathing soft and steady, he stared at the ceiling, his thoughts a storm of doubt and dread. He didn't know what he feared more, the possibility that the letter was a cruel, baseless lie, or the chance that it was the truth. Jason stared out of the office window, the city skyline stretching endlessly in front of him. His mind replayed the events of the previous night. Claire's soft words, her gentle touch, and the shadow of doubt that clung to every moment. He hadn't slept. The letter remained a phantom in his thoughts, its weight far heavier than the paper it was printed on. He picked up his phone, scrolling mindlessly through messages, until his gaze fell on Claire's name in his recent calls. His thumb hovered over it. A part of him wanted to call her, to hear her voice and silence the storm in his mind, but he couldn't. Not yet. Jason. Tom's voice broke through his thoughts. His friend and attorney leaned casually against the doorway, a cup of coffee in hand. You look like you've been hit by a freight train. What's going on? Jason forced a smile, shaking his head. Nothing, just work piling up. Tom wasn't convinced. Come on, man. We've been friends for years. I know that look. Something's eating at you. Jason hesitated, the words hovering on the edge of his tongue. Could he trust Tom with the letter? Would sharing it lighten the burden or solidify his fears? It's personal, he finally said. Tom raised an eyebrow. Claire? The name alone sent a jolt through Jason's chest. He tried to laugh it off, but it came out hollow. No, it's fine. Just relationship stuff. You know how it is. Tom studied him for a moment longer, but didn't push. Well, if you need to talk, you know where to find me. Jason nodded as Tom left, but the conversation only deepened the pit in his stomach. His world was unraveling, and he was powerless to stop it. By the time he returned home that evening, the weight of the day had grown unbearable. Claire was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. The sight was disarming, almost painfully normal. Hey, you're home late, she said with a smile, turning to greet him. Yeah, busy day, Jason replied, his voice tight. He set his bag down and leaned against the counter, watching her move with practiced ease. She was radiant, every action effortless, but the doubt gnawed at him. Everything okay? Claire asked, sensing his tension. Jason hesitated. The letter burned in his pocket, a reminder of everything he couldn't say. We need to talk, he said finally, his voice low. Claire froze, the knife in her hand hovering midair. About what? He swallowed hard, his throat dry. Us. I've been thinking a lot lately, about where we're headed, about everything. Her brow furrowed, concern clouding her features. Jason, what's going on? You're scaring me. He looked away, unable to meet her eyes. I think we need some time apart. I need to figure things out, on my own. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Claire set the knife down slowly, her hands trembling. You're breaking up with me? No! The denial was automatic, but even as he said it, Jason realized how hollow it sounded. It's not like that. I need space, to think, to clear my head. Claire's voice cracked as she spoke. Space? Jason, we've been together for years. You can't just decide this out of nowhere. I'm not deciding out of nowhere, he said, his frustration bubbling to the surface. This has been on my mind for a while. I just didn't know how to bring it up. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. So you've been feeling like this and I had no idea? Did I do something wrong? Is this because of me? No, Jason said quickly, stepping closer. It's not you. It's me. I'm the one who needs to figure things out. Please, Claire, try to understand. She turned away, gripping the edge of the counter for support. I don't understand. I don't understand how you can look me in the eye and say these things. I thought we were building a life together. We were, Jason murmured. We are. I can't explain it right now. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. If you're walking away, Jason, I won't stop you, but don't expect me to wait for you to figure out what you want. Her words struck like a dagger. Jason wanted to reach out, to pull her close and tell her it wasn't real, that it was all a test, a twisted attempt to protect himself. But he couldn't. Instead, he nodded, his heart shattering with every step he took toward the door. That night, as he lay in the emptiness of his new apartment, Jason stared at the ceiling, haunted by Claire's tear-streaked face. The letter sat on the nightstand, a cruel reminder of the doubt that had driven him to destroy everything. Jason sat on the worn leather couch in his new Bellevue apartment, a place that felt more like a temporary prison than a home. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. His gaze darted to the envelope on the coffee table. Its contents burned into his memory. "Claire is with you for your money. Wake up before it's too late." He clenched his jaw, his mind racing. The words had slithered into every corner of his thoughts, suffocating his ability to think clearly. Was it a cruel joke, a baseless lie, or was it the truth? His fingers hovered over his phone. He had already taken the first step, breaking away from Claire, but the doubts hadn't disappeared. If anything, they had grown louder, screaming for proof. A knock at the door pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. Jason opened it to reveal a tall man in his late 40s, dressed in a crisp gray suit. "Mr. Trivett?" the man asked, his voice steady but impersonal. "Yes," Jason replied, stepping aside to let him in. "I'm Henry Wyatt, the private investigator you hired. I've got an update." Jason nodded, his stomach twisting into knots as he gestured for Henry to sit. He wasn't sure if he wanted to hear what came next, or if he could handle it. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice betraying the tension beneath his calm facade. Henry opened a sleek black folder, pulling out a series of photographs. "Your girlfriend, or ex-girlfriend as you mentioned, has been fairly consistent in her routine. Work, errands, meeting with a friend at a local cafe." His voice trailed off as he laid a specific photo on the table. Jason's eyes locked onto the image. There was Claire, sitting at an outdoor table, her head slightly bowed as she spoke to a man Jason didn't recognize. He felt his breath hitch, a pang of jealousy stabbing through his chest. "Who is that?" he asked sharply. Henry raised an eyebrow. "That's what I've been trying to determine. She's met him twice this week, always at the same cafe." Jason's pulse quickened. Twice? Why hadn't she mentioned anything? "What else did you find?" he pressed. Henry hesitated for a moment before sliding another photo forward. This one showed Claire entering a bank. "She's made 3 transfers to a private account in the last 2 months. The transactions are significant, but the recipient's identity is obscured for privacy." Jason stared at the photo, his mind reeling. Money transfers, a man he didn't know. The doubts that had simmered now boiled over into something more volatile: suspicion. "Keep digging," he said finally, his voice hard. "I need to know who he is and what's going on." Henry nodded, collecting the photos before leaving. Jason remained frozen, his thoughts a chaotic storm. He wanted answers, but deep down he feared what they might reveal. The following day, Jason parked his car across the street from the cafe where Claire had been spotted. His heart raced as he watched her walk inside, her demeanor calm, her expression unreadable. She took a seat near the window, glancing at her phone. Minutes later, the man from the photograph arrived. Jason gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language spoke volumes. The man leaned forward, speaking intently, while Claire nodded, her face a mix of concern and determination. The sight sent a surge of anger and confusion through Jason. Why hadn't she told him about this? What was she hiding? The hours stretched endlessly as Jason's mind played out every worst-case scenario. By the time Claire left the cafe, he was no closer to understanding. He started the car, following her at a distance. She drove to a modest neighborhood, pulling into the driveway of a small house. Jason parked a few houses down, watching as she disappeared inside. The house seemed ordinary, nothing suspicious at first glance. But the longer Jason sat there, the more his paranoia grew. He considered confronting her, demanding the truth, but fear rooted him in place. What if the answer was something he didn't want to hear? As night fell, Jason finally drove away, his chest heavy with unanswered questions. Back at his apartment, he paced the floor, his mind spinning. He replayed the cafe scene, The house, the man's face, trying to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his trance. It was a message from Claire. "I hope you're okay. I know this is hard for both of us, but I'm here if you ever want to talk." Jason stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. Her words sounded sincere, but sincerity didn't equal truth. He didn't respond. Instead, he tossed the phone onto the couch and sank into the chair, his head in his hands. The shadows of doubt and suspicion had become his constant companions, and he didn't know how much longer he could endure their weight. Jason leaned against the kitchen counter of his dimly lit apartment, the silence pressing against his thoughts like a vice. The photos Henry had shown him earlier still lay sprawled across the counter. His eyes fixated on one, the image of Claire sitting across from the man at the cafe. Something about the man's demeanor gnawed at Jason. He didn't look threatening, yet his presence felt intrusive, unwelcome. Who was he? And why hadn't Claire mentioned him? The questions had rooted themselves deep in Jason's mind, spreading doubt like a poison. Grabbing his phone, Jason dialed Henry's number. The investigator picked up after 2 rings. "Wyatt," came the curt greeting. "I need to know more about the man Claire's meeting," Jason said, his voice tense. "What does he want from her, and why is she transferring money?" Henry sighed, the sound static through the receiver. "These things take time, Mr. Trivette. I've already reached out to some contacts, but tracing personal transactions without access to her financial records is tricky. You need to be patient." "Patience isn't something I have right now," Jason snapped. He pinched the bridge of his nose, trying to reel in his frustration. "Just keep digging. I need answers." After hanging up, Jason turned back to the photos. Every fiber of his being urged him to confront Claire, but something held him back. Fear or guilt? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that he couldn't rest until he understood the truth. The next day, Jason returned to the cafe where Claire had been meeting the man. He parked in the same spot as before, scanning the street as he waited. He felt ridiculous sitting there like a spy in his own life. But the alternative, doing nothing, felt unbearable. Claire arrived 10 minutes later, her expression calm but distracted. She took her usual seat by the window, ordered a coffee, and waited. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he watched her. She looked normal, no signs of deception or guilt. But that only made the situation more confusing. Then the man appeared. Tall, with a casual confidence in his stride, he approached Claire and greeted her with a warm smile. She stood, hugging him briefly before they sat down. Jason gritted his teeth, a surge of jealousy flaring in his chest. Their conversation seemed animated, their expressions shifting between seriousness and lightheartedness. Jason reached for his phone, snapping a few photos of them together. The act felt invasive, wrong even, but his desperation outweighed his guilt. He zoomed in on the man's face, studying every detail, the slight stubble on his jaw, the faint scar above his left eyebrow. He didn't recognize him. An hour passed before Claire and the man left the cafe. Jason followed from a safe distance, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. They didn't go far, just a few blocks to the same small house Claire had visited before. Jason parked down the street, watching as the man unlocked the front door and held it open for Claire. She hesitated briefly, glancing over her shoulder as if sensing someone was watching, but then disappeared inside. The door closed behind her, leaving Jason alone with his thoughts. What was she doing in there? Why hadn't she told him about this? The longer he sat there, the more his paranoia grew. He imagined every possible scenario, each one worse than the last. Was she confiding in the man, planning a future without him? Or was it something even darker? Jason's phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. It was a text from Tom. "You okay? Haven't heard from you since yesterday." Jason ignored it, his focus solely on the house in front of him. Hours passed, the light outside fading into dusk. When Claire finally emerged, she looked tired but resolute, her face set with an expression Jason couldn't read. She got into her car and drove away without a glance back. Jason stayed parked for a while longer, his mind a storm of questions. He knew he couldn't keep sitting on the sidelines waiting for answers to come to him. If he wanted the truth, he'd have to dig deeper, no matter the cost. That night, back in his apartment, Jason stared at the photos on his phone. The man's face seemed to taunt him, a puzzle piece he couldn't place. He opened a search engine, typing in every detail he could remember about the man. But the results were inconclusive, leaving him more frustrated than before. As the clock ticked past midnight, Jason made a decision. He'd confront Claire directly. No more games, no more waiting. He needed to know who the stranger was and why she was keeping secrets. The thought of the confrontation sent a shiver down his spine, but he knew it was unavoidable. Jason paced the length of his apartment, his thoughts circling like vultures around the image of Claire, walking into the house with the man. He'd spent the night replaying every moment in his mind, every subtle glance, every word Claire had said over the past few weeks. It wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed answers. The knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find Henry Wyatt standing there, a folder tucked under his arm. The investigator's expression was unreadable, his tone clipped. "Mr. Trivett, I have some updates. May I come in?" Jason stepped aside, his pulse quickening. As Henry sat down, he placed the folder on the table with deliberate care. "The man your girlfriend has been meeting is Thomas Easton. He's listed as her half-brother. They share the same father." Jason blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. "Half-brother?" he repeated, his voice skeptical. "Why hasn't she ever mentioned him before?" Henry adjusted his tie. "From what I've been able to gather, he's recently come back into her life. Their father left both families decades ago. Thomas appears to be in some financial and legal trouble, and Claire has been helping him." Jason felt a pang in his chest, a mixture of relief and something darker. If what Henry was saying was true, then Claire wasn't hiding an affair. But why had she kept this from him? "What kind of trouble?" Jason asked, his tone sharp. Henry opened the folder and slid a document across the table. "He's being sued for breach of contract by a former business partner. The amount is substantial. Claire has made 3 large transfers to his account over the past 2 months." Jason stared at the document, his jaw tightening. 3 transfers, 3 betrayals, it felt like. He couldn't decide if he was angrier about the secrecy or the sacrifices Claire had made without telling him. "Why didn't she come to me?" he muttered, almost to himself. Henry remained silent, giving Jason space to process the information. Finally, Jason leaned back in his chair, his hands gripping the edges. "So she's risking her own financial stability for him? Does she even know what she's getting into?" "I can't answer that," Henry replied, his tone neutral. "But it's clear she's deeply involved in trying to help him." Jason nodded absently, his mind a whirlwind. After Henry left, Jason sat in silence, staring at the papers spread out before him. The relief he'd felt moments ago was quickly overshadowed by frustration. Claire had made these decisions without him, without trusting him enough to share the burden. And then there was the deeper question gnawing at him. Was her secrecy a sign that she didn't see him as a true partner? Unable to sit still, Jason grabbed his keys and headed out. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he couldn't stay cooped up any longer. His car seemed to drive itself, the route familiar now. Within minutes, he was parked outside the small house where Claire had met Thomas. The house was dark, the curtains drawn. Jason sat in his car, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. He debated whether to knock, to demand an explanation, but something stopped him. Instead, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through their old messages. He stopped at one from a few weeks ago, Claire telling him she'd be out late helping a friend. The pieces began to fit together, but they didn't form a complete picture. Not yet. As the minutes ticked by, Jason's frustration turned to resolve. He needed to confront Claire, to ask her why she'd hidden this from him. And yet, a part of him dreaded the conversation. What if her secrecy wasn't just about Thomas? What if there was more she wasn't telling him? That evening, Claire returned home to her apartment to find Jason waiting outside. She froze when she saw him, her keys clutched tightly in her hand. "Jason," she said cautiously, "what are you doing here?" He stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk." Her brow furrowed and she glanced toward her door. "Now's not a good time. I just got back." "Now is the perfect time," Jason interrupted. his voice firm but calm. "You've been keeping things from me, Claire, and I can't ignore it anymore." Claire's shoulders tensed, but she didn't argue. She unlocked the door and gestured for him to follow. Inside, the air was heavy with unspoken tension. She set her bag down, her movements slow and deliberate. "What do you want to know?" she asked finally, turning to face him. Jason took a deep breath. "Who is Thomas? And why are you giving him money?" Her eyes widened briefly before narrowing. "You've been following me," she said, her voice low with disbelief. "That's how you know." Jason didn't deny it. "You didn't leave me much choice, Claire. You've been hiding this from me. I need to understand why." She crossed her arms, her expression a mix of anger and hurt. "Thomas is my half-brother. He's in trouble and I'm helping him because that's what family does. I didn't tell you because I knew you wouldn't understand." Jason's voice rose, the frustration spilling over. "How could I understand if you didn't give me the chance? Do you have any idea what it's been like, watching you keep secrets and not knowing why?" Claire's voice cracked as she replied, "And do you have any idea what it's been like for me, carrying this alone, knowing that if I told you, you'd judge him or me?" The room fell silent, their words hanging heavy in the air. Jason stared at her, his anger ebbing into something else. Sadness, fear, a realization that their relationship was fraying and neither of them knew how to stop it. Jason sat in his car outside Claire's apartment, the cold light of his dashboard casting an eerie glow across his face. His chest felt heavy, burdened with the weight of their earlier confrontation. Claire's words echoed in his mind. "I knew you wouldn't understand." Was she right? Had his doubts poisoned the very foundation of their relationship? He picked up his phone and dialed Henry Wyatt, his voice tense. "I need more information on Thomas Easton. Anything you can find." Henry sighed audibly. "Mr. Trivett, I've already told you, this is a delicate process. Financial records, legal trouble, it all takes time." Jason's grip tightened on the phone. "Time is a luxury I don't have. Keep digging, Wyatt." After hanging up, Jason leaned back, his fingers tapping an uneasy rhythm on the steering wheel. He needed to figure this out, fast. Every instinct told him there was more to this story, and he wasn't going to stop until he unraveled it. The next day, Jason returned to his office, the bustling hum of his team doing little to distract him. His assistant knocked on the door, entering with a pile of reports. "Mr. Trivett, the legal department flagged an issue with one of our partnerships. It's urgent." Jason barely glanced up. "Handle it. I'm in the middle of something." His assistant hesitated. "Understood." She left quietly, closing the door behind her. Jason opened his laptop, typing "Thomas Easton legal trouble" into the search bar. The results were sparse. News of a lawsuit, whispers of a failed business deal, but nothing concrete. Frustrated, he slammed the lid shut and ran his hands through his hair. That evening, Jason decided to pay Sophie Rivers a visit. If anyone knew more about Claire's life, it was her. Sophie opened the door, surprise flickering across her face. "Jason, what are you doing here?" "We need to talk," Jason said firmly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Sophie folded her arms, her posture defensive. "About what?" "About Claire, about Thomas." His voice was sharp, almost accusatory. "You're her best friend. Don't tell me you don't know anything." Sophie hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "What exactly are you accusing her of, Jason?" Jason stepped closer, his frustration boiling over. "She's been hiding things from me, meeting her so-called half-brother, transferring money to him. Why hasn't she told me any of this? What else is she keeping from me?" Sophie's expression softened, but her tone remained firm. "Did you ever think that maybe she didn't tell you because she's trying to protect you? Jason, not everything is about you." Jason froze, her words hitting him like a blow to the chest. "Protect me from what?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "From the mess Thomas is in," Sophie replied, her gaze unwavering. "You think she enjoys keeping secrets? She's been losing sleep over this, trying to figure out how to help him without dragging you into it." Jason felt his resolve waver, but the doubts still lingered. "Why didn't she trust me enough to tell me?" Sophie sighed, shaking her head. "Because you're not exactly an open book, Jason. You keep everything bottled up, your fears, your doubts. She sees that, and it scares her." Her words cut deeper than Jason wanted to admit. He left Sophie's apartment feeling no closer to the truth, but her accusations lingered in his mind. Was he really so closed off that Claire felt she couldn't confide in him? Back at his apartment, Jason found himself staring at the folder Henry had left behind. He opened it, flipping through the pages once more. The details of Thomas's legal trouble painted a grim picture: a failed real estate venture, a lawsuit from a former partner, and mounting debts. Jason's phone buzzed. It was Henry. "I dug a little deeper, Mr. Trivett. Found something interesting about Thomas's business dealings. He's been blacklisted by several banks due to unpaid loans. If Claire's been helping him, she's likely putting herself at serious financial risk." Jason's stomach turned. Claire was risking everything. For someone she'd barely known until recently, it didn't make sense. "Find out how much she's given him," Jason said, his voice tight. Henry hesitated. "I'll do what I can, but this isn't exactly legal territory." "I don't care," Jason snapped. "Just do it." As the call ended, Jason sank into the couch, his mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they painted was far from clear. Why was Claire so determined to help Thomas? Was it simply loyalty to family, or was there something more? His thoughts were interrupted by a text from Claire. "I know things have been tense between us. Can we talk tomorrow? There's something I need to tell you." Jason stared at the screen, his chest tightening. What was she going to say? Was this the moment everything came to light? Or was it another carefully crafted omission, designed to keep him in the dark? Jason sat on the edge of his bed, Claire's message still glowing on his phone. Her words, "There's something I need to tell you," repeated in his mind like a haunting refrain. The timing was almost too convenient. Was she finally ready to come clean about Thomas, or was this another attempt to keep him at bay? The next evening, Jason arrived at Claire's apartment. She greeted him with a tentative smile, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "Thanks for coming," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. The air was thick with tension, and Jason's heart pounded against his ribs as he stepped inside. Claire gestured to the couch, sitting down across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy and oppressive. Finally, Claire took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I owe you an explanation." Jason leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "You think?" Claire flinched at the sharpness in his tone but pressed on. "The man you've seen me with, his name is Thomas. He's my half-brother. We didn't grow up together, but we reconnected recently, after my dad passed." Jason's jaw tightened, his mind racing. "Why didn't you tell me about him before?" "I didn't know how," Claire admitted, her voice trembling. "It's complicated. My dad left his family, left Thomas, when he started a new life with my mom. Thomas grew up resenting us, and I didn't even know he existed until a few months ago." Jason's hands balled into fists. "And now you're just throwing money at him? How much, Claire? How much of your savings have you given him?" Claire's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "That's none of your business." Jason shot to his feet, pacing the room. "None of my business? Are you serious? You've been lying to me for months, meeting him in secret, transferring money, and now you're saying it's not my business?" "I wasn't lying," Claire said, her voice rising. "I was protecting you." "Protecting me from what?" Jason demanded. "From the truth? From the fact that you've been hiding things from me?" Claire stood, her face flushed with anger. "Yes, Jason, from the truth. Because I knew this is how you'd react. You don't trust me. You never have." Jason froze, her words hitting him like a slap. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" Claire challenged, her voice breaking. "You've been following me, spying on me. If that's not distrust, then what is it?" Jason's chest heaved, the weight of her accusation pressing down on him. "I had to, Claire. You left me no choice. You've been keeping secrets. How was I supposed to feel?" Claire shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Do you even hear yourself? You're so consumed by your paranoia that you can't see what's right in front of you. I've been trying to help my brother, my family, and instead of supporting me, you've been digging for dirt." Jason's voice dropped, low and bitter. "And what about us, Claire? Where do I fit into all of this? Or do I only matter when you need something from me?" Claire's expression crumbled, and for a moment she looked completely shattered. "That's not fair," she whispered. I've sacrificed so much for us, for you, and you're acting like I've betrayed you." Jason's laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. "Because you have. Maybe not the way I thought, but you have. Trust goes both ways, Claire, and you've made it very clear that you don't trust me either." The room fell silent, their words hanging heavy in the air. Claire wiped at her tears, her shoulders shaking with the effort to hold herself together. "I never wanted this," she said finally, her voice small and broken. "I never wanted things to get so complicated." Jason felt the sting of her words, but said nothing. He didn't know how to respond, didn't know if there was anything left to say. The chasm between them felt insurmountable, and for the first time, Jason wondered if it could ever be bridged. As he turned to leave, Claire called out, her voice raw with emotion. "Jason, wait." He paused, his hand on the doorknob, but didn't turn around. "What?" Claire hesitated, her voice trembling. "I never stopped loving you. No matter what you think, that hasn't changed." Jason closed his eyes, her words cutting deeper than he'd thought possible. Without a response, he walked out the door, leaving Claire standing alone in the shadows of her apartment. Jason stared at the reflection in his bathroom mirror, his jaw clenched, eyes bloodshot from another sleepless night. His confrontation with Claire replayed in his mind like a relentless loop. Her accusations stung, but the deeper wound was the truth he couldn't deny. His distrust, his paranoia, his inability to let her in. But why hadn't she trusted him? Why did she keep him in the dark while shouldering the burden alone? The question burned at the core of his thoughts, refusing to let him rest. He splashed cold water on his face and grabbed his phone. He couldn't take the silence any longer. The call went straight to voicemail. Jason exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He had to see her, to clear the suffocating fog between them. Without hesitation, he grabbed his jacket and keys, heading out into the chilly night. The drive to Claire's apartment was quick, his thoughts consuming every second. When he arrived, her car wasn't in the driveway. His heart sank as he realized she wasn't home. Hesitating for a moment, he considered leaving, but instead parked and waited. Minutes turned into hours. The streetlights buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across the pavement. Finally, headlights illuminated the driveway and Claire's car pulled in. She stepped out, her movements slow and weary, her silhouette illuminated by the overhead light. Jason got out of his car, his presence startling her. "Jason!" Her voice was a mixture of surprise and exhaustion. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he said firmly, stepping closer. Claire's shoulders tensed, her eyes narrowing. "I think we've talked enough." "Claire, please," Jason said, his voice softer now. "I'm not here to fight. I need to understand." Her gaze softened for a brief moment before she sighed and gestured toward the apartment door. "Fine, come in." Inside, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Claire placed her bag on the counter, not bothering to take off her coat. She turned to face Jason, her expression guarded. "Say what you need to say." Jason hesitated, the words caught in his throat. Finally, he spoke. "I'm sorry for how I've handled this, for following you, for doubting you. I didn't know how else to deal with everything." Claire's expression flickered, a mix of pain and frustration. "Jason, do you even realize what you've done? You've broken something between us, something I'm not sure can be fixed." Her words were a gut punch, but Jason forced himself to continue. "I know, and I hate myself for it. But you've been keeping secrets too, Claire. You've made choices without me, and it feels like you don't trust me either." Claire's voice rose, a rare show of anger. "I didn't trust you because I knew this is how you'd react. You've been so wrapped up in your fears that you can't see past them. I was trying to protect you, Jason, not push you away." Jason stepped closer, his voice firm but desperate. "Protect me from what? From your brother? From the mess he's in?" "Claire, I don't care about any of that. What I care about is us. And right now, it feels like I'm losing you." Claire's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away. "I've been losing you too," she whispered. The room fell silent, the weight of their words hanging heavily between them. Finally, Claire sank onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. "I don't know if we can come back from this, Jason. Too much has happened. There's too much broken." Jason sat beside her, his voice trembling. We can fix it. I don't know how, but we can. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Just don't give up on me, on us. Claire looked at him, her tears streaming down her cheeks. I don't know if I can trust you again. I don't know if I can trust myself. Jason reached for her hand, but she pulled away, the distance between them feeling insurmountable. Maybe we both need time, she said softly, her voice cracking. Jason nodded slowly, the pain in his chest nearly unbearable. If that's what you need, I'll give it to you. But I'm not giving up. Not on you, not on us. Claire didn't respond, her gaze distant. Jason stood, his movements slow and deliberate. As he opened the door to leave, he turned back to look at her one last time. She didn't meet his eyes, and it felt like a knife twisting in his heart. The door closed behind him, the night air biting against his skin. Jason walked to his car, his steps heavy. He didn't know if he'd done the right thing, but he knew he couldn't keep running from the truth. Jason gripped the steering wheel tightly, the faint hum of the engine blending into the background of his turbulent thoughts. His conversation with Claire still lingered in his mind, every word cutting deeper with each replay. He had promised to give her time, but the void it left was suffocating. He didn't know where he was driving. The city blurred around him, neon lights and darkened streets blending into one. Finally, he pulled into the parking lot of a quiet park, the faint glow of streetlights reflecting off the lake in the distance. It was peaceful, still. Everything his mind wasn't. Jason leaned back in his seat, staring up at the ceiling of the car. For the first time in years, he felt completely lost. His success, his wealth, his carefully constructed life, none of it mattered now. It all felt empty, hollow, without Claire. A soft chime from his phone broke the silence. It was a notification from Henry Wyatt. The message was brief. Call me. Found something important. Jason's pulse quickened as he dialed the number, holding the phone to his ear. Henry picked up on the second ring. Mr. Trivett, Henry began, his tone cautious. I've been looking further into Thomas's situation, and I came across something unexpected. Jason sat up straighter. What is it? There's another account linked to Claire's transfers, Henry said. It appears she's been moving money into a secondary fund, but it's not connected to Thomas directly. I think she's trying to cover multiple debts, possibly her own. Jason's stomach dropped. Her own? Why would she have debts? That doesn't make sense. I'm still piecing it together, Henry said. But if I were you, I'd talk to her again, soon. Jason hung up, his chest tightening. Claire hadn't mentioned anything about her own struggles. Was this another secret? Another layer to the web she was spinning? Unable to shake the unease, Jason drove to a nearby cafe to clear his head. As he parked, his gaze caught on a familiar figure sitting alone at a corner table. It was Claire. Her hair was pulled back, her posture slumped, and her face buried in her hands. Jason hesitated, unsure if he should approach. She looked so fragile, so unlike the strong, composed woman he'd always known. Before he could decide, Claire's shoulders began to shake, her quiet sobs barely audible through the glass. The sight was like a punch to his gut. He had never seen her cry like this, not even during their worst arguments. She was breaking right in front of him, and all he could do was watch. Jason stepped out of the car, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked into the cafe, the soft chime of the doorbell catching Claire's attention. Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face filled with a mixture of surprise and vulnerability. Jason, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He slid into the seat across from her, his gaze unwavering. Claire, what's going on? She wiped at her eyes, her movements hurried and clumsy. Nothing, I'm fine. Don't do that, Jason said gently. Don't shut me out. Not now. Claire's resolve crumbled, her walls collapsing under the weight of her emotions. I can't keep doing this, she said, her voice breaking. I can't keep pretending like I have it all together. I'm so tired, Jason. I'm just so tired. Jason reached across the table, taking her trembling hands in his. Then stop pretending, he said softly. Talk to me. Let me help you. Claire's eyes filled with fresh tears as she looked at him. I don't know how. Every time I try, it just falls apart. I didn't want you to see me like this." Jason's grip tightened on her hands, his voice firm but tender. "You don't have to carry this alone. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out, together." Claire nodded weakly, her tears falling freely now. For the first time in weeks, Jason felt a sliver of hope, a fragile, tentative connection beginning to form between them. The silence that followed wasn't heavy or suffocating. It was peaceful, a quiet understanding passing between them. Jason didn't know what the future held, but for now, he was willing to stay in this moment, to be the support Claire needed. Jason stared at the neatly folded letter in his hands, his name written in Claire's delicate script. The envelope was still sealed, but the weight of it was crushing. He had come to her apartment that morning hoping for answers, but all he found was this, a goodbye note left on the kitchen counter. His heart pounded as he peeled the envelope open, his hands trembling. He unfolded the single sheet of paper, Claire's handwriting wavering across the page. "Jason, I don't know how to say this face to face, so I'm writing it instead. I need time and space to figure out who I am without all the noise and complications. You've been everything to me, but right now, I feel like I've lost myself in trying to hold us together. It's not fair to either of us. Please don't try to find me. I promise I'll reach out when I'm ready." Claire. Jason sat down on the couch, the letter slipping from his fingers. The room felt hollow, like the air had been sucked out of it. He looked around, taking in the little signs of her absence. The empty hooks where her keys usually hung, the missing blanket she always draped over the couch. He couldn't believe she was gone. Grabbing his phone, Jason dialed her number, his breath catching when it went straight to voicemail. He left a message, his voice strained. "Claire, it's me. I got your letter. Please, call me. We can work through this together. You don't have to do this alone." The silence that followed felt deafening. For the next few hours, Jason tried to distract himself, burying his frustration in work. But no matter how many emails he sent or documents he reviewed, his mind kept wandering back to Claire. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart leaped, only to sink when it wasn't her. By evening, Jason couldn't take it anymore. He drove aimlessly through the city, his mind racing with questions. Where had she gone? Was she safe? Did she truly believe this was the only way? He ended up at their favorite park, the place where they'd spent countless evenings walking and talking about their future. The sight of the familiar bench where they used to sit felt like a punch to the gut. Jason sat down, his head in his hands. For the first time in years, he felt completely powerless. He had built his life on control, on solving problems, fixing what was broken. But now, he didn't know what to do. He couldn't force Claire to come back. He couldn't undo the damage that had been done. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Looking up, he saw Sophie standing a few feet away, her expression hesitant. "I figured I'd find you here," she said softly, sitting beside him. Jason didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I heard about Claire," Sophie continued. "She told me she needed some time away." Jason turned to her, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Did you know about this? Did you know she was planning to leave?" Sophie shook her head. "No, Jason, she didn't tell me anything, but I'm not surprised. She's been carrying so much for so long. I think she just needed to breathe." Jason exhaled sharply, his hands tightening into fists. "And I'm the reason she can't?" Sophie placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice gentle but firm. "You're not the only reason, Jason, but you have to admit you didn't make it easy for her. You pushed her away with all your doubts, your need to control everything." Her words stung, but Jason couldn't deny their truth. He looked down at his hands, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to protect her." "I know," Sophie said, "but sometimes protecting someone means letting them figure things out on their own." The two of them sat in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. For the first time, Jason realized that maybe this wasn't just about Claire leaving. It was about him learning to let go. As the night deepened, Jason stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "Thanks, Sophie," he said quietly, "for being honest." She nodded, her gaze steady. "Take care of yourself, Jason. And when Claire's ready, be there for her. That's all you can do." Jason walked back to his car, the letter still tucked in his pocket. As he sat behind the wheel, he looked up at the stars, their faint light a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always hope. Jason sat in his darkened apartment, the glow of the city filtering weakly through the blinds. The letter from Claire sat on the coffee table in front of him, its folded edges worn from his restless handling. It was all he had left of her, a paper tether to a relationship that felt more distant with every passing hour. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. How had it come to this? He replayed every fight, every misunderstanding, every unspoken fear. There were no clear answers, only a gnawing guilt that he had been too blinded by his own insecurities to see what Claire had been trying to tell him all along. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Henry Wyatt. Jason stared at the screen for a long moment before picking up. "What is it?" he asked, his voice hollow. "I've uncovered something you might want to see," Henry said. "It's about Claire's financial situation. Can you meet me in the morning?" Jason's pulse quickened. "No, tell me now." Henry hesitated. "She has a second account, a trust fund. It looks like it was set up years ago by her father. The deposits stopped about a decade ago, but the withdrawals? Those have been steady. From what I can tell, she's been draining it to cover not just Thomas's debts, but other expenses too, some of them personal." Jason's chest tightened. "What kind of expenses?" "Medical bills, mostly," Henry said. "Large sums paid to various providers over the last 6 months. But here's the thing. None of the accounts are in her name. They're all tied to Thomas." Jason's breath caught. Medical bills? Why hadn't she told him? "Are you saying Claire's been paying for Thomas's treatment?" "That's my guess," Henry replied. "But without more access, I can't confirm." Jason ended the call without another word. The weight of this new revelation pressed down on him, suffocating. Claire had been fighting battles he hadn't even known existed, shouldering burdens that weren't hers to bear. And she had done it all alone. His thoughts spiraled as he tried to piece together the timeline. Why hadn't she told him about this? Was it shame? Pride? Or had she simply not trusted him to understand? The questions burned in his mind, each one more painful than the last. The next morning, Jason found himself driving to the small house Claire had visited with Thomas. He parked down the street and walked the rest of the way, his steps heavy with trepidation. When he reached the front door, he hesitated. Would Thomas even talk to him? Would he even be there? Summoning his courage, Jason knocked. The sound echoed in the quiet neighborhood, and for a moment he thought no one would answer. Then the door creaked open, revealing Thomas. He looked older than Jason had imagined, his face lined with exhaustion. "Can I help you?" Thomas asked, his tone wary. "I'm Jason," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Claire's—" He paused, unsure how to define their relationship anymore. "I need to talk to you." Thomas's expression hardened. "About what?" Jason hesitated before stepping closer. "About Claire and about you." Thomas leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "What about us?" "Why hasn't she told me the truth?" Jason demanded. "About your debts, the money she's been giving you, the medical bills." Thomas's eyes flickered with something, anger, guilt, pain. "Because she didn't want you to know," he said bluntly. "She thought you'd judge her, or me." Jason's jaw tightened. "She should have trusted me." Thomas's laugh was bitter. "Trust? You think you've given her any reason to trust you? You've been following her, spying on her, trying to dig up dirt instead of just asking her what's going on." The words hit Jason like a punch to the gut. "I was trying to protect her," he said weakly. "Protect her from what?" Thomas snapped. "From helping me, from making her own choices. You don't get to decide that for her." Jason fell silent, the weight of Thomas's words sinking in. He had been so consumed by his own fears, his need to control, that he hadn't stopped to consider what Claire truly needed from him. "Look," Thomas said, his voice softening slightly. "Claire loves you, but she's been through enough. If you really want to help her, stop making it about you." Jason nodded slowly, the words cutting deep but resonating with a truth he couldn't ignore. As he turned to leave, Thomas called out, "And for what it's worth, she didn't leave because of me. She left because she thought it was the only way to save what's left of you two." Jason walked back to his car, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. For the first time, he saw things clearly, not as a series of betrayals, but as a tangled web of love, sacrifice, and fear. If he wanted to untangle it, he'd have to start with himself. The grand hall was buzzing with life, every corner of the venue glowing under a canopy of string lights. It was Claire's charity gala, an annual event she had spent months organizing to raise funds for struggling families. Jason stood near the entrance, his heart pounding in rhythm with the gentle hum of conversation. Tonight was his chance, a moment he had to seize before the distance between them became irreparable. Claire moved gracefully through the crowd, her emerald dress shimmering under the soft lights. She smiled as she greeted attendees, but Jason could see the weight behind her eyes. The Claire he loved was still there, but she looked fragile, as if carrying the world on her shoulders. Taking a deep breath, Jason stepped forward. The room seemed to blur around him as he approached her, his steps deliberate and slow. When she noticed him, her smile faltered, replaced by a guarded expression. "Jason," she said softly, her tone neutral but wary. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "There's something I have to say." Claire glanced around, her discomfort evident. "Now isn't the time. I'm in the middle of—" "It can't wait," Jason interrupted, his voice firm. "Please, just give me a few minutes." Her hesitation was brief, but she nodded, leading him toward a quieter corner of the hall. The chatter of the crowd faded as they stepped into the shadows, the tension between them palpable. "What is it?" she asked, her arms crossing defensively. Jason took a moment to gather his thoughts, his chest tight with the weight of everything he needed to say. "I've made so many mistakes, Claire," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "I let my fears get the best of me. I doubted you when I should have trusted you. I pushed you away instead of pulling you closer." Claire's expression softened slightly, but her walls remained up. "Jason, we've been over this. Apologies aren't enough anymore." "I know," Jason said quickly, his voice cracking. "But this isn't just an apology. It's the truth. I was scared, terrified, because I've never had anything as real as what we had. And when I got that letter, it fed into every insecurity I've ever had. I thought I was protecting myself, but all I did was destroy what mattered most." Claire's eyes flickered with something, a mix of sadness and longing, but she didn't respond. Jason took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I know about the money, about Thomas, about everything you've been trying to handle on your own, and I know now that I should have been there for you instead of making you feel like you had to carry it all alone." Tears welled in Claire's eyes, but she blinked them away, her voice trembling. "Why now, Jason? Why are you telling me this now when it might already be too late?" "Because I can't let it be too late," he said, his desperation evident. "Because I love you, Claire, and I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I'm begging you for one." Claire turned away, her hands gripping the edge of the table behind her. She didn't speak for what felt like an eternity, her silence cutting deeper than any words could. Finally, she turned back to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you even understand how much you hurt me? How much it hurt to feel like I wasn't enough for you to believe in me?" Jason nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I do, and it's something I'll regret for the rest of my life. But I'm here now, Claire. I'm here, and I'm ready to fight for us, if you'll let me." The room seemed to hold its breath as Claire studied him, her defenses wavering. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Jason," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I'll prove it to you," he promised, his grip on her hand firm. "However long it takes, whatever it takes, I'll prove that I'm worthy of your trust." Claire searched his eyes, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling over. She nodded, the faintest hint of a smile breaking through her sorrow. "Then start now," she whispered. "Start by showing me you mean it." Jason exhaled shakily, the weight of her words settling over him like a fragile hope. He knew this was just the beginning of a long road, but for the first time in weeks he felt a spark of light in the darkness. The faint sound of applause broke the moment, reminding them of the world beyond their private corner. Claire pulled her hand away, her composure returning. "I have to get back to the event," she said, her tone steady but kind. "We'll talk more later." Jason nodded, watching as she disappeared back into the crowd. His heart ached, but it also swelled with determination. This wasn't the end. It was the first step toward rebuilding everything they had lost. Jason adjusted his tie as he stood outside the community center, the mid-morning sun casting long shadows across the pavement. Today was the opening ceremony for the new family support program, a project Claire had been working tirelessly on for months. Though their reconciliation was still fragile, Jason had promised her he'd be there to support her. This was the first step in proving his commitment. The air inside buzzed with quiet excitement. Volunteers moved purposefully between tables set with brochures, resource lists, and refreshments. Jason spotted Claire near the stage, speaking with a group of donors. She looked radiant, her smile genuine despite the exhaustion he knew she must be feeling. When she caught sight of him, her expression shifted, an unreadable mix of surprise and hesitation. She excused herself from the group and walked over, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. "You came," she said simply, her voice carrying both relief and caution. Jason nodded, his hands tucked into his pockets to hide their slight tremble. "I told you I would. I meant it." Claire glanced away briefly, her gaze softening as it swept over the room. "This is important to me, Jason. These families, they're going through things most people can't even imagine." "And so are you," Jason replied gently. "I'm just sorry it took me so long to see that." Her eyes flickered to his, the vulnerability in them almost breaking him. But before she could respond, an organizer called her name, motioning for her to come to the podium. Claire sighed, offering him a small, tentative smile. "We'll talk later, okay?" Jason watched as she ascended the stage, her poise and confidence commanding the room. As she spoke about the program's mission and its potential to change lives, Jason couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, strong, compassionate, and unyieldingly determined. After the ceremony, Jason waited as Claire mingled with guests, shaking hands and thanking donors. When the crowd began to thin, she finally made her way back to him. "Sorry for making you wait," she said, her tone lighter now. "I don't mind," Jason said with a small smile. "You were incredible up there." Claire flushed slightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Thank you. It means a lot to hear that." They stood in silence for a moment before Claire spoke again, her voice more tentative. "I've been thinking about what you said at the gala, about earning my trust." Jason's heart thudded in his chest. "And?" Claire hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the bracelet on her wrist. "I don't know if I'm ready to jump back into us, but I'm willing to see if we can rebuild what we had." Jason exhaled deeply, relief washing over him. "That's all I could ask for, Claire. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said with a faint smile. "This isn't going to be easy." Jason nodded solemnly. "I'm not expecting easy. I just want a chance." The days that followed were a delicate balancing act. Jason threw himself into his work and personal growth, attending therapy sessions to address his insecurities and learning to let go of his need for control. He also made small but meaningful gestures to show Claire he was committed, helping with her programs, listening without judgment, and giving her the space she needed. Their interactions remained cautious but warmer. Claire allowed him glimpses into her life again, sharing bits and pieces of her struggles and triumphs. Jason cherished these moments, no matter how small, as signs that the cracks in their relationship were slowly mending. One evening, Claire invited him over for dinner. It was the first time she had opened her home to him since their separation. As they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, sharing a simple meal, Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of tentative hope. "Do you remember our first date?" Claire asked suddenly, a hint of nostalgia in her voice. Jason chuckled softly. "How could I forget? I was so nervous I spilled water all over the table." Claire laughed, the sound warm and genuine. And I pretended not to notice because I didn't want you to feel embarrassed. Jason smiled, the memory a bittersweet reminder of how far they had come and how much they had endured. I was terrified of messing things up back then. I guess some things never change. Claire's expression softened and she reached across the table, her hand brushing against his. Maybe we're not as broken as we think, she said quietly. Maybe we just need to figure out how to heal together. Jason swallowed hard, emotion thick in his throat. I'd like that, Claire, more than anything. For the first time in what felt like forever, the distance between them didn't seem so vast. They still had a long way to go, but in that moment, Jason felt something he hadn't in months. A glimmer of hope for a future they could rebuild, one piece at a time. Jason sat on the edge of the park bench, his fingers nervously tracing the edge of the small box in his coat pocket. Around him, the quiet hum of the park carried on. Children's laughter, the occasional bark of a dog, and the rustle of leaves in the cool autumn breeze. But Jason's focus was singular, fixed on the woman walking toward him. Claire approached with careful steps, her scarf fluttering slightly in the wind. She looked beautiful, serene yet cautious. It had been weeks since their tentative reconciliation, weeks of rebuilding small bridges and navigating the unspoken tensions between them. And now, Jason felt ready to take the next step, though he wasn't sure if she felt the same. Hey, she said softly, sitting down beside him. Her eyes searched his face, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. You sounded serious when you asked to meet. Jason exhaled, his breath visible in the crisp air. I wanted to talk about us. Claire's smile faded slightly, replaced by a more guarded expression. Okay, she said carefully. What's on your mind? Jason turned toward her, his gaze steady but vulnerable. I know we've been taking things slow, and I'm glad we are. But I also know I haven't told you enough, shown you enough, how much you mean to me. Jason, Claire began, but he held up a hand. Let me finish, he said gently. I spent so much time doubting you, doubting us because I was afraid of losing you, of being hurt. And in doing that, I became the very thing I feared most, a reason for you to leave. Claire's lips parted, but she didn't interrupt. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, the weight of his words sinking in. Jason reached into his pocket, pulling out the small box. Claire's breath hitched as he opened it to reveal a delicate silver bracelet, simple yet elegant. This isn't about grand gestures or trying to fix everything at once, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It's about showing you that I'm committed to us, to rebuilding what we lost, one piece at a time. Claire stared at the bracelet, her expression a mixture of surprise and hesitation. Jason, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Jason replied, his tone earnest. I just want you to know that I'm not giving up. Not on you, not on us. Claire reached out, her fingers brushing the bracelet before meeting his gaze. It's beautiful, she whispered, her voice trembling. But it's not about this, Jason, it's about trust. I know, Jason said, his voice steady, and I'm willing to earn it no matter how long it takes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Claire took the bracelet from the box, her movements slow and deliberate. She slipped it onto her wrist, the metal gleaming softly in the sunlight. Okay, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Let's try. Jason felt a rush of relief so powerful it left him momentarily speechless. He reached for her hand, holding it gently. Thank you, he said, his voice full of gratitude. For giving me this chance. Claire nodded, her eyes still glistening. Don't waste it, she murmured, her tone both a warning and a plea. I won't, Jason promised, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. The two of them sat in silence for a while, the park's quiet rhythm continuing around them. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and Jason knew the road ahead would still be fraught with challenges. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile but real chance to rebuild what they had lost. Later that evening, as Jason walked back to his apartment, he replayed the moment in his mind. The way Claire had looked at him, the faint smile on her lips, It was enough to keep him moving forward. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt like he was finally on the right path. At home, Jason sat down at his desk, opening his laptop. He began drafting a letter, not to Claire but to himself. A commitment to change, to grow, to be the man she deserved. As he wrote, he felt a sense of clarity, a determination to let go of the fears and insecurities that had held him back for so long. Claire's trust was fragile, like a delicate thread that could break with the slightest strain. But Jason was determined to protect it, to nurture it, until it became strong enough to withstand anything. He didn't just want her to believe in him, he wanted to believe in himself. And for the first time, he felt like he could. Jason stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his shirt. The nervous energy coursing through him was palpable. Tonight was important. More than that, it felt pivotal. After months of careful effort, cautious words, and slow but steady healing, Claire had invited him over for dinner. It wasn't just dinner, though. It was a symbol, a sign that maybe, just maybe, their relationship was no longer defined by what had broken them, but by the hope of what they could rebuild. The drive to Claire's house was quiet, the soft hum of the radio doing little to ease Jason's racing thoughts. He clutched the bottle of wine he had brought, rehearsing lines in his head. He didn't want to push too hard or say the wrong thing, but he also didn't want to hold back. Tonight was about honesty, about showing her how far he had come and how far he was willing to go. When Claire opened the door, her smile was warm, but tinged with a hint of nervousness. She wore a simple, elegant dress, her hair pulled back in a way that framed her face beautifully. Jason's breath caught, as it always did when he saw her. "Hi," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "Hi," Jason replied, his voice just as soft. He handed her the wine and she gestured toward the dining room. The table was set simply but thoughtfully, with candles casting a warm glow over the space. The aroma of roasted vegetables and herbs filled the air, and Jason couldn't help but smile. This felt familiar, like a glimpse of what their life used to be, and what it could be again. They ate quietly at first, the conversation polite and light. Jason asked about her work, and she asked about his latest project. It wasn't until they had finished eating and were sitting on the couch with glasses of wine that the mood shifted. "Jason," Claire began, setting her glass on the coffee table. Her hands fidgeted slightly, a sign of her lingering unease. "I need to say something." Jason placed his glass down, his full attention on her. "I'm listening." Claire took a deep breath, her gaze meeting his. "These past few months, they've been hard, for both of us. But I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about trust, about rebuilding. And I realized that as much as I've wanted you to prove yourself to me, I needed to do the same." Jason's brow furrowed slightly, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I wasn't honest with you either," Claire admitted, her voice heavy with emotion. "I kept things from you because I was scared. Scared that you wouldn't understand, that you'd judge me or see me differently. But in doing that, I pushed you away. I didn't give you the chance to be the partner you wanted to be." Jason reached for her hand, holding it gently. "Claire, I wasn't exactly making it easy for you. I gave you every reason to doubt me." Claire shook her head, her grip tightening around his. "No, Jason, we both made mistakes. But what matters now is that we're here, together. And I want us to keep moving forward, slowly, carefully, but forward." Jason's chest swelled with emotion, his throat tight. "I want that too, more than anything." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared understanding settling over them. Jason's free hand reached into his pocket, pulling out a small envelope. He handed it to Claire, his heart pounding as she opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. It wasn't long, but every word was chosen with care. It detailed his journey, his fears, his mistakes, and his unwavering commitment to being better, for her and for himself. As Claire read it, tears filled her eyes, and when she looked up, her expression was soft, her walls lowered. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This means more than I can say." Jason smiled, his own eyes glistening. I just wanted you to know how serious I am about us, about making this work. Claire set the letter aside and leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. For the first time in what felt like forever, they both allowed themselves to relax, the tension between them dissolving into something warmer, more hopeful. As the evening wore on, they talked about the future, not in grand, sweeping terms, but in small, meaningful ways. Claire mentioned wanting to take a trip together, to start fresh somewhere quiet and peaceful. Jason spoke about learning to balance his work and personal life better, to be present in the moments that mattered. By the time Jason left, the air between them felt lighter, more open. As Claire hugged him at the door, she whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me, on us." Jason smiled, his heart full. "I'll never stop trying, Claire. Not as long as you'll have me." Jason stood in front of the small art gallery, the crisp winter air biting at his cheeks. His hands clutched a carefully wrapped package, a gift he had spent weeks preparing. Tonight marked a milestone not just for Claire's career, but for their relationship. It was her first art showcase, a collection of pieces she had poured her heart into, and Jason couldn't be prouder. As he stepped inside, the warmth of the gallery enveloped him. The walls were adorned with Claire's work, paintings and sketches that told stories of resilience, hope, and transformation. The room buzzed with quiet conversation, guests admiring her art while sipping champagne. Jason spotted Claire near one of her larger pieces, engaged in conversation with an older couple. She wore a deep blue dress, simple yet elegant, her hair loosely pinned back. She looked radiant, her smile genuine, and Jason felt his chest tighten with admiration. When their eyes met, Claire's expression shifted, surprise followed by a soft, welcoming smile. She excused herself from the couple and made her way over to him. "You made it," she said, her voice carrying a mix of relief and joy. "Of course I did," Jason replied, his smile matching hers. "I wouldn't miss this for anything." Claire glanced at the package in his hands. "What's that?" Jason's smile turned sheepish. "A little something for you, but you'll have to wait until later to open it." Claire raised an eyebrow but didn't press. "Fair enough. Come on, let me show you around." She led him through the gallery, pausing at each piece to share its inspiration. Some were abstract, others more literal, but all of them carried a common thread: growth and healing. Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Claire had managed to turn their shared pain into something beautiful, something meaningful. "This one," Claire said, stopping in front of a smaller painting. It depicted a fractured vase, its cracks carefully mended with gold. It's called kintsugi. It's inspired by the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery. The idea is that the cracks and imperfections become part of the piece's history, making it even more beautiful. Jason stared at the painting, his throat tightening. "It's perfect," he said quietly. Claire smiled, her eyes glistening. "It's one of my favorites." The evening continued, filled with compliments and congratulations from guests. Jason stayed by Claire's side, watching as she gracefully navigated the crowd, her confidence shining brighter than ever. Toward the end of the night, when most of the guests had left, Jason finally handed her the package. "Now's the time," he said, his voice tinged with nervous anticipation. Claire unwrapped it carefully, revealing a beautifully crafted journal. The leather cover was engraved with a delicate pattern, and inside, each page was lined with soft cream-colored paper. Tucked into the front pocket was a handwritten note. Claire pulled out the note, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded it. Jason watched as she read, her expression shifting from curiosity to deep emotion. "Claire, this journal is for the next chapter of your story, our story. I know I can't erase the mistakes I've made, but I hope we can fill these pages with new memories, new dreams, and new beginnings. You've taught me that the cracks don't have to define us. They can make us stronger. Thank you for letting me be part of your journey. Yours, Jason." When Claire looked up, tears shimmered in her eyes. "Jason," she began, her voice breaking. "This is incredible. I don't even know what to say." Jason reached for her hand, holding it gently. "You don't have to say anything. Just let this be a symbol of how much you mean to me. and how much I'm willing to fight for us." Claire nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." They stood in silence for a moment, the world around them fading away. For the first time in a long time, Jason felt a deep sense of peace. They weren't perfect, and they never would be, but they were trying, and that was enough. As the gallery lights dimmed and the last guests trickled out, Jason and Claire walked out together, their steps in sync. The journal in Claire's hands felt heavier than it looked, not because of its weight, but because of the promise it carried. They didn't need to speak. The quiet between them wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, of love, and of the hope that together they could weather anything. Jason stood in the arrivals terminal of the airport, his heart thundering in his chest. The cold tile beneath his feet and the quiet hum of announcements echoing overhead did nothing to ground him. He scanned the crowd anxiously, searching for Claire among the sea of travelers. She had spent the past 2 weeks in Denver, visiting an old college friend and taking time to recharge. This was the first time she had been away since they had begun piecing their relationship back together, and every day of her absence had felt like an eternity. When his eyes finally landed on her, his breath caught. Claire wheeled a small suitcase behind her, her posture relaxed, her face framed by loose waves of hair. Her expression brightened the moment she spotted him, and she quickened her pace. "Jason," she said, her voice carrying both warmth and relief. She stopped just short of him, her eyes searching his face. Jason smiled, his chest tightening at the sight of her. "Welcome back," he said, his voice soft but steady. Claire's lips curved into a smile and she stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him in a hug that was both gentle and firm. Jason closed his eyes, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, and for the first time in weeks, the tight knot in his chest began to loosen. The drive home was filled with light conversation, details of Claire's trip, stories about her friend, and Jason's updates on work. The ease between them felt natural, though underlined by a quiet anticipation. They both knew their relationship was still fragile, but the distance had also provided clarity. Back at Jason's apartment, they settled onto the couch with cups of tea, the warm light of a single lamp casting soft shadows across the room. Claire curled her legs beneath her, her gaze thoughtful as she sipped her tea. "I've missed this," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the quiet. "Being here with you." Jason set his cup down, leaning forward slightly. "I've missed you too," he said, his voice earnest, "more than I can say." Claire looked down at her hands, her expression hesitant. "These past few weeks I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began. "About us, about everything we've been through." Jason's heart thudded painfully in his chest, but he nodded, waiting for her to continue. "I realized something while I was away," Claire said, her voice soft but steady. "I've been holding on to a lot of fear of letting you in, fear of being hurt again. But I also realized I don't want that fear to control me anymore. I don't want it to keep me from you." Jason reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. "Claire," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you don't know how much that means to me." She met his gaze, her eyes glistening. "It's not going to be easy, Jason. There's still so much we need to work on. But I want to try. I want to rebuild what we had. Together." Jason's grip on her hand tightened, his chest swelling with emotion. "I want that too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "more than anything." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their words settling over them. Then Claire shifted closer, her hand moving to rest against Jason's cheek. "We're not the same people we were before," she said softly. "But maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it means we can build something even stronger." Jason leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly. "As long as we're building it together, I'll take whatever we can create." Claire smiled, her expression a mixture of hope and determination. "Then let's start now," she said, her voice firm yet gentle. Jason nodded, his heart steady for the first time in a long time. Together, they began to talk, really talk, about their fears, their hopes, their dreams for the future. The conversation stretched late into the night, and by the time Claire finally fell asleep in Jason's arms, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. They weren't perfect and they never would be, but they were together. And that was enough. Jason sat on the back porch of Claire's home, the golden hues of a setting sun painting the horizon. A soft breeze rustled the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of blooming flowers. He held a cup of tea in his hands, its warmth seeping through his fingers, grounding him. Across the small table sat Claire, her own cup cradled gently as she gazed out at the view. It had been weeks since their reunion, weeks filled with quiet moments like this, moments of reflection, of growth, and of healing. Jason had learned to savor them, to appreciate the stillness that once felt uncomfortable. He no longer needed grand gestures or dramatic declarations. He simply needed her presence. Claire broke the silence, her voice soft yet clear. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Jason turned to her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Every day," he admitted. "It feels surreal sometimes, like we're learning how to love all over again." Claire nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "I think we are, but this time we're doing it differently, better." Jason's smile widened. "You've taught me a lot, Claire, about patience, about vulnerability, about what it really means to trust someone. And you've taught me that it's okay to lean on someone else," Claire replied, her gaze meeting his. "I used to think I had to do everything alone, that letting someone in would make me weak. But you showed me that strength comes from connection, not isolation." Jason reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "We've both learned a lot, and I think that's what makes this, us, stronger. We're not just holding on to what we had, we're building something new." Claire's fingers tightened around his, and for a moment they simply sat in silence, the weight of their shared understanding filling the space between them. Then Claire smiled, a playful glint in her eyes. "You know, I never thought you'd be the kind of guy to enjoy gardening." Jason laughed, the sound light and genuine. "I never thought so either, but there's something about it that's calming. Plus it makes you happy, so that's a bonus." Claire rolled her eyes, though her smile didn't fade. "You're not half bad at it, you know. The tomatoes we planted are actually thriving." "I had a good teacher," Jason said, his tone warm. Claire's laughter joined his, the sound blending with the rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. It was moments like these that reminded Jason of what they had fought for, the quiet, unassuming joy of simply being together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Claire leaned back in her chair, her expression turning serious. "Jason," she said softly, "there's something I've been meaning to tell you." Jason's heart skipped a beat, his attention fully on her. "What is it?" Claire hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her cup. "I've been thinking about us, about everything we've been through. And I realized I've never been as honest with anyone as I've been with you, and that scares me." Jason's brow furrowed, his concern evident. "Why does it scare you?" "Because it means I'm vulnerable," Claire admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "And being vulnerable means trusting you completely, trusting that you won't hurt me again." Jason leaned forward, his voice firm but gentle. "Claire, I can't promise I'll never make mistakes, but I can promise that I'll do everything in my power to make sure you never feel alone again. You mean too much to me to let fear get in the way." Claire's eyes shimmered with emotion, her lips curving into a small, tentative smile. "Thank you," she said simply, "for understanding, for staying." Jason reached for her hand again, holding it tightly. "Thank you for giving me the chance to." The sun had long since set, but the warmth between them lingered, steady and unyielding. They didn't need words to fill the silence. The lessons they had learned about love, trust, and resilience were etched into their hearts, guiding them forward. And for the first time in a long time, Jason felt not just hopeful, but certain that the life they were building together, piece by piece, was worth every struggle, every tear, and every lesson along the way.